Sandra's a full-time professional astrologer with a master's degree in psychology. And for 26 years, she wrote a weekly astrology column for the Sun newspapers in northeastern Ohio. And she has over 25 years of experience. She's worked with thousands of clients from all over the US. She teaches, lectures, and makes media appearances. She's also certified by ISAR and the American Federation of Astrologers, and she serves as president of the Rocky Mountain Astrologers Organization as well. So, Sandra, it's wonderful to have you with us. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you with us, Sandra. We're very interested in your expertise and your research work. I originally read your article in the Mountain Astrologer about the prenatal eclipse. So I want to ask you, first of all, Sandra, if you could explain to us and our listeners exactly what an eclipse actually is.
Well, eclipses are actually, in the simplistic way that I could describe them, they are conjunctions and oppositions of a new or full moon. The difference is that we get a new and a full moon every month when the sun and the moon line up. The difference with an eclipse has to do with something called declination, the nodes of the moon. It's very technical stuff, but it has to line up not only in longitude from the ecliptic, but also from the celestial equator, north or south. And that only occurs 4 to 6 times a year. Sometimes it's 4 to 8 times a year. And that describes what an eclipse is.
Well, that's interesting for us to know. I also wanted to ask you if you could explain the different types of eclipses. So we all know that there are lunar eclipses and solar eclipses, but how do they differ? And what do they mean?
They differ. You know, first of all, you have to understand, if you think of the solar system, so we have the Earth, and then we have the Sun, and of course there's planets in between the Earth and the Sun, but the Moon orbits around the Earth orbits around the Sun. So when there's a solar eclipse, what happens is we have the Earth and the Moon and the Sun lined up together. But when we have a lunar eclipse, the Earth is in the middle with the Moon on one side and the Sun on the other side. So there's this pull of gravity having to do with the Moon, and then we have the solar influence on the other side. And that's why during a regular full moon, people get a little crazy because it supposedly affects the water level, you know, the fluid level in your brain, and a lot of things happen. There's often domestic violence. There's often more difficulty if you're having surgery, which we try to avoid clients if it's not an emergency. Don't do surgery 5 days before or 5 days after the full moon, because there's too much of a chance of something going wrong. And so, to get back to your question, there's a couple different types of eclipses. The most powerful ones are total eclipses. And there's also partial, so it means that the disk of the moon isn't totally occluded, you know, by the sun. You know, I mean, it's complicated. And then there's the annular eclipses, and you just see the ring instead. And there's the penumbral, which is just a shadow. So again, there are different types of eclipses, of course. But the total are the most powerful because they have to line up with the node of the moon. And a lunar eclipse has to be within 3 degrees and 45 minutes of the node. The moon has to be that close, or you're not going to have an eclipse. With the solar eclipse, it's within 9 degrees, 55 minutes of one of the nodes. So you see the difference, why total lunar eclipses are so very powerful. And by the way, in a year, if I look at my calendar, you can get maybe 2 in a year, sometimes only 1 in a year. So they're not that common.
And can you explain to us why the ancients considered eclipses to be so ominous in terms of world events?
Well, you know, it scared them when the sky darkened, right? If it was daylight and there was an eclipse, they got a little frightened, and then they always observed that there was some kind of big change that happened to anything, different things would happen. And that's because it would affect individual charts. It would also affect the charts of certain countries and the world. So I think they didn't consider every single eclipse ominous, but only certain ones, like the total ones that darken the sky. And even today, we can look at eclipses and see where the shadow falls across the earth. And that's where we're most likely to see some political or geographical activity, like, earthquakes and things like that. I mean, not every single time. It depends on the eclipse.
It's fascinating, Sandra, that given the amount of research, the amount of validation we have about astrology, about the fact that eclipses do herald events that will occur in our world, isn't it fascinating that generally people still don't acknowledge how our lives and our world are completely somehow intertwined with the cosmos?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. But on one hand, Steve, I kind of think it's a bit of a blessing in disguise, because we'll never really convince the scientists, not in maybe our lifetimes, that this is a valid study. And if we did, then you would never get anybody's birth certificate or birth time or anything. So in some ways, maybe it's not such a bad thing. The other thing is that I really believe that people who study astrology are a very special group of people. And if you looked up the word esoteric, people who study astrology have esoteric knowledge. They have a certain way of thinking. This is not the average person, and it never will be. Esoteric means information or knowledge that's available to a selective few. It's not available to everybody. You're a psychic medium. Not the average person can't do what you do. You understand that? And I really believe it's the same thing with astrology. Not everybody gets it. They don't see the patterns. They can't grasp it. So in some ways, I think it's privileged to be able to study it, to understand it, to practice it. And again, I don't really think it's for the general population. It would be wonderful if schools taught some things about it, but because they can't prove it scientifically, right, they're not going to accept it. Psychology for a long time was on the same level as sort of a pseudoscience, right? That took a long time until Freud came along and really tried to establish it as something scientific, which means you could reproduce the results. But with astrology, there's other factors, as you know. There is a free will factor, there is a destiny factor. And some people are more governed by the destiny, and others have a little more leeway or flexibility within that, right? They do have some choices that can change or modify the outcome of their life.
And Sandra, can I ask you what caused you to investigate the significance of the prenatal eclipse, or the eclipse that occurs most recently or prior to a person's birth?
Well, that's a good question. I guess I've always liked eclipses. I've had visions of a past life I had, and in that past life, which was very ancient, I had a memory of drawing horoscopes up in the sand and showing where the planets were. And I feel in that lifetime I mainly used eclipses as a way to predict events. And I guess it carried over into this lifetime because I've always been fascinated with them. Now, the prenatal eclipse, because I'm so interested in past lives and soul purpose, the prenatal eclipse intrigued me to the point that I had a friend named Rose Lineman, and she's been dead a number of years, and she wrote a book on it, and I happened to be glancing through her book one day, and realizing what wonderful information, and it hasn't been written about lately. And I think this is information that needs to come to the surface again. And the book she wrote was Your Prenatal Eclipse. It was published by the AFA, the American Federation of Astrology, and her name was Rose Lineman. And I guess once I started to study it, I thought, how fascinating is this? Because as we'll get into in this interview, Steve, you can figure out how many years you've had between births and like when you died and how many years before you came back again, and what are you teaching in this lifetime? Why are you here? I mean, it's fascinating stuff.
It really is. It really intrigued me, and I find your work absolutely fascinating. Can I ask you then, how do you identify from a person's natal chart, including the prenatal eclipse, how long they spent in spirit between their previous passing and their current incarnation or point of birth into this world?
So if you know astrology, what you do is you grab the ephemeris, or you use your software program on your computer, you look up your birth year, and you find the solar eclipse that fell within 6 months of your birthday. It could fall hours before you were born, but it can't fall after you were born. So you look that up, and it could be anywhere from 5 and 7/8 months to, again, hours before you're born. And then you put that in now many people born in that 6 month period are going to have the same prenatal solar eclipse, but there's a big difference. And the difference is the sign it's in and the house placement and the aspects it makes to other planets in your chart. That's what is unique to the individual. So you do look at where your prenatal solar eclipse is, and then you count the number of degrees between that and the next planet in the chart, and you count that counterclockwise. And when you find that planet, each of those degrees represent the number of years you spent in spirit before you incarnated again. And when I do it with my clients, Steve, I find sometimes, I found it a matter of years, like a year or two, and then I found it up to 90 years. It just depends on the chart. And it's interesting to find out the year someone died, because you can go back to that year and kind of see what was going on in the world. There's no guarantee they were in America, of course, but like people who died sometimes in the 20s, or like in 1929, that was the crash of the stock market. So you could kind of align it with certain historical events that might or might not be significant to them.
Well, I want to ask you, Sandra, an example. It's my example because I read your article with fascination, and you're very, very interesting, and I find your work really enlightening. But my prenatal eclipse occurred just a few degrees prior to or before my natal Mars. And my natal Mars is my worst planet. It's next to or conjunct the North Node with Neptune on the other side of it. And my Mars is very discordant. Can you explain?
Is your Mars
it's under the sign of
Scorpio?
Sagittarius, actually.
Oh, it's in where?
It's the prenatal eclipse was in the sign of Sagittarius in the 3rd house, and the planet, the next planet over, is Mars in Sagittarius, and my Mars is extremely discordant, and then I have Neptune just on the other side of the North Node.
Well, that's fascinating to me, Steve, because, my goodness, it makes a lot of sense. I'm sorry, to me it does, that in another lifetime, with that, how many degrees apart is it that comes to Mars?
I think I'll pull up my chart. I think it was just a few degrees.
So you would have died about, do you mind telling your birth year?
I was born in 75, and I've done some research on it. I think I know how I died, and I think I know who was involved through Synastry. I think I know what happened, but I was interested to ask you because this concept is just so interesting.
Well, so it could have been a violent death with Mars, or there could have been self-defense or something, but it doesn't, it does seem, or you were involved in a war or something like that. But because you have that north node in the middle of the Mars and the Neptune,
it's not
so what do you
Sandra,
think? You come back here and you help people, right? You're helping people with the Neptune, with your psychic abilities. You're helping them understand about their loved ones who have passed over. I mean, it's kind of like doing penance in this lifetime or retribution for that other lifetime. Not that you were a horrible person, but in this lifetime, the focus was very much more on the spiritual than anything else. That's how I see it for you.
Interesting.
So,
thank you. That's very
so
interesting.
your chart is quite interesting as well with the Mars and the Neptune. However, that also gives you, I'm assuming the Neptune's in Sagittarius then?
It is, yes.
Yeah. So that gives you your psychic ability, but that north node tells you that's the path to head down, right?
Yes.
The north node is the harder path, but the path that brings much more evolvement to people. So you always want to, the south node, people say, oh, you have to avoid the energies of the south node, you're repeating a pattern, but I say sometimes you have to be in that south node to get to know who you are, but you have to leave it behind and head toward the north node. So if your north node is in Sagittarius, it's no surprise, right, that you've published books, that you broadcast, right? You get to the masses with Sagittarius, which is higher laws of the universe, what do I want to say, schools of thought that expand the normal boundaries of how we think of the world and the meaning of life. So you're really fulfilling that north node. The south node in Gemini just says you could deal with a lot of information, right? But you have to turn it more into knowledge. You have to turn it into sort of a body of knowledge that has a deeper meaning, that's all. So it's not so bad to have the south node in Gemini. I know you don't seem like a gossip to me, but you could say that maybe you were just very curious and inquisitive when you were younger, and you might have asked a lot of people information, and that's all fine because that became the foundation for your later works, which you're doing now. So that's pretty good, I think.
Thank you, Sandra. So, in essence, anybody out there can look at their chart, and they can get their chart on the internet. But if they look at the north node, it shows them a direction they should work towards. And they look at the south node of the moon, it's like a little horse. They're both like horseshoes, aren't they? But if they look at the south node, it suggests where they're comfortable or where they've focused in the past. Is that right?
That's right. You have to see the house it's in and the sign it's in, so you can look at the expression. And here's another thing. You deal with clients like I do, Steve. So you get a client who's very unhappy. They are most likely not following their north node. If you get into the north node, you're going to be a lot happier in your life. That's because you're on the right path. And when you're on the right path, things fall into place. As I'm sure people have said to you, that if you follow your bliss and do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. You understand that because you love your work, right?
Wonderful. So if we work towards the north node, we're generally happier. We feel a sense of fulfillment, of growth and reward.
Right.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I want to ask you now, I wrote a book, Sandra, about mass murder and how astrology can be really useful to understand a person's psyche and also look at when they would be likely to take action if they were going to do something negative. And I found the whole concept of eclipses, particularly if a person's born under an eclipse, found that very interesting. I'm not suggesting that everybody out there born under an eclipse is a mass murderer, but can you help us understand whether there is a different interpretation for a prenatal eclipse that we might consider to be more positive or versus a challenging or negative eclipse?
Well, after I read that you wrote that book, so I did a little research. I think you wrote about James Holmes, right?
Yes.
Didn't you write about him? And so I ran his chart because they had a birth time on him. What a fascinating chart. And his prenatal solar eclipse was exactly conjunct his natal moon in the last degree of Virgo. And it was right with his south node. So he was born with the moon conjunct the south node. And normally, with a moon south node conjunction, normally, there might be some issues with the mother. Now, we can't say that's true in his case, but that's normally what we see, like let's say the majority of the time. And it doesn't mean there was anything wrong with his mother. Maybe it was his relationship to her that was suspect. But so when he committed these terrible acts of murder, there were eclipses that happened that triggered them a year before and 6 months before. So he was born with a Sun-Saturn conjunction and Uranus, which is control issues, right? And Uranus is sort of like, terribly impulsive action. You're not thinking, no forethought. And his moon and South Node actually squared, or there was a discordant energy between the moon, the sun, the Saturn, and the Uranus, and even his vertex, which is a fated part of the chart. So he had like these three planets and a point, and I mean there was like 6 different things, among other things. So all I'm saying is that in his natal chart, it did show that there was a predisposition to some mental disorder, right?
Yes.
Because mania was definitely there with the moon square Uranus. And not every person who has the moon square opposed Uranus has bipolar problems. It's true. But sometimes those people will be around someone who does, so they learn about it. But so in his chart, I don't know if we could prevent these things, because remember, there are how many people born that day? Of course, they're not born at the same time he is, in the same location. That's where it becomes more individual. Because the ruler of his ascendant, Leo, is the sun. And the sun was with Saturn and Uranus. And you're not going to find everyone with a Leo rising who was born on that day. But there will be a lot of people in the world. And sometimes it's dependent on their genetics, their past life karma. So there are, the birth chart to me shows you so much information, but you still have to consider where the person came from out of a past life and what they're really doing in this lifetime to really figure out how their life might turn out. So that's what makes the difference. But yeah, that is a fascinating chart because these eclipses were just unbelievable. Like a month before he committed the alleged murders, he allegedly committed the murders, there was a lunar eclipse at 14 degrees of Sagittarius. That was conjunct his Mercury. Mercury's your mind. Mercury's your choices. So it's saying that there was a heightened energy that kind of set his mind off at that time. Now, on a higher evolved soul, we might find a person who writes something beautiful and gives it to the world, right? It's not always that it has to be negative. That's the choice people make. So I think they also, if you remember, because I know you've studied astrology in depth, the ancients said that people born on solar eclipses had blindness, but I don't find that to be true. Have you? I haven't really found that. I haven't
found that to be an indication of blindness. I haven't found that to be particularly an indication of blindness.
But that's what the old textbooks said. But I have found people born within a day or two of an eclipse to have lives that are very interesting, as the Chinese say, may you live in interesting times, that kind of life, where they might have had things that happened in their childhood, not necessarily abuse, but just things that were out of the ordinary for the average person. So that could be anything from discord with their parents to a dysfunctional family. So there's many things it could be. But I find people born near eclipses also a lot of them, not all of them, a lot of them tend to be evolved souls or souls that have some really strong lessons that they're learning in this lifetime. Maybe I should put it that way. So that's also quite fascinating. I think someone should do a study on people born right around the solar. I think the solar eclipse is the more powerful one, but I still see effects from the lunar eclipse too.
This is what's exciting about astrology. There's so much untapped research to be done.
Yeah,
it's fascinating. And I want to ask you more about your research and your areas of interest after our break. We're just going to take a short commercial break for 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get back and continue our conversation.
A new era in psychic services has begun. PsychicAccess.com. You can connect with our psychic advisors by telephone or chat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All of our psychic advisors are interviewed, fully verified, and accuracy tested, assuring you quality service. We're living in some very troubled times right now. More and more, the world's problems are affecting us on a personal level. You don't have to deal with this alone. Our highly accurate psychics, caring advisors, and talented mediums can help with situations you are currently experiencing and can let you know what the future may hold for you. All new customers get a free 6-minute reading. All you have to do is register. Why not visit us now and get a free reading at psychicaccess.com.
Welcome back, Sandra. Well, Sandra, I was fascinated to hear about the prenatal eclipse and how that can help us to understand the lifetime that we're engaging in. Have you got some things you can share with us about past lives? How we might look at a chart and understand previous lives?
Yeah, there's some really definite techniques that do work that I find when you're trying to interpret past lives. Now, I have to preface it with, just like with you, Steve, there are certain things that are just innate, like they're easy for you to do, and that's how it is for me to look at past lives in a chart. But there are some ground rules that would help people. So the first thing you look at are squares. So if a square in a chart between one planet and another would indicate that is something that you have not mastered in a past lifetime. So that's something that's going to be an issue in this lifetime. As an example, if you had the sun square to Mars, then you have to work on your aggression in this lifetime. And it says you never mastered that before. Now, if you had a trine with the sun and Mars, it would say that's a talent that you have mastered, and it wouldn't need much work at all. It would just be a natural talent that would come to you. So squares and oppositions tend to be lessons that we're working on. And the same thing with semi-squares and sesquiquadrates and quincunxes. So these are all planetary aspects that show we're working on this. And then if you have trines and sextiles and quintiles, that the quintiles are often latent talents that come out a little later in life. The trines, again, you've mastered whatever the two planetary energies are as they work very well together. And the sextile says you are working on these in this current lifetime, like you're working on mastering it, so you're almost there. So you would have natural talent. Like people who have Mercury sextile Neptune often have some psychic ability, and it's pretty developed but not fully developed. So that's what the sextile means. Now, we take that a level further, which is fascinating. And if you have squares in fixed signs or oppositions in fixed signs, that would indicate that these issues that you're working on have come from many, many, many lifetimes. Like they've developed over many lifetimes. You never got it. You never learned the lesson. If those squares and oppositions happen to be in cardinal signs, it says, well, maybe they only developed in the last lifetime or the lifetime before that. So, and those, by the way, you overcome with action, with motivation, with kind of approaching it, looking at it, confronting it. Fixed signs you have to approach with ego and will and desire. Those are harder because you have to set the ego aside to master it. In mutable signs, if you have a square between two planets, it says it's an issue that's forming in this lifetime, and those are the easiest ones to overcome. So if I look at a chart and someone has Venus square Pluto, and let's say it's from Venus is in Leo and Pluto's in Scorpio, then I know that their lessons have a lot to do with how they love people, and sometimes it could have to do even with sexuality. So if I see a Venus-Pluto square, I know this person in a previous lifetime or a couple of lifetimes was too possessive, too jealous, too kind of limiting of the other person's free will. And so they might have, man or woman might have had, sexual encounters that were superficial, right? There's kind of a bit of a misuse of that energy. So in this lifetime, they're really working on that. And so it's I mean, you can take Venus, you can take Mars aspects. Wow. You can take moon aspects to Saturn, and that's like where people can put a shell up around them, and they're kind of afraid to express, and maybe it was from their childhood that they tried to express, but they were stifled, and so they have a guard up, so to speak. So it's really fascinating to look at these things, because it in a chart, it really helps you understand the cardinal, fixed, and mutable signs and how difficult the issue is. Fixed signs being, like if you had a grand cross or a T-square in fixed signs, we sometimes see addictive personalities. But I say to people, addictions aren't always substance abuse. There's other addictions or sexual addictions. There's other addictions that aren't as bad as that, but still need some kind of balance. So you could have a T-square in fixed signs, and you could be maybe addicted to your work. And a lot of people who are authors are often, they write in a day they might write 8 hours or 6 hours. So they're kind of addicted to it, but they create beautiful things. So as I said, you have to look at it at the evolvement of the person that you're talking to and how mature they are and how much wisdom they've gained to see if that's going to really be a problem or not.
And Sandra, even people that don't know,
too. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just thinking, even people that don't know much about astrology can run their charts on the internet. They can see where there are oppositions and squares, and they can, if it's Venus square Uranus, for example, they can look on the internet, interpretation of Venus square Uranus or whatever it may be, and they can read about that particular challenge or issue and really appreciate that is something that they need to work hard on in this lifetime. So they don't have to be astrologers to identify these things.
You're right, but they also, astrology has to be in the hands of people who kind of don't overreact to these things either. I know when you teach astrology and someone sees a Saturn cycle coming, they always think they're going to die. Well, you don't die under Saturn cycles. That would probably be the easy way out.
Yes.
But they can't misinterpret it or take it as a negative. They have to see it in the context of the entire chart, right? And you know that. But it's true, with Venus square Uranus, that's freedom and love. Those are the basic key words for those two planets: Venus, love; Uranus, freedom. So if you have a square with Venus and Uranus, maybe you want to get married a little later in life, or maybe you want a spouse, if you get married at all, you want a spouse who doesn't try to limit your activities or demand too much of your attention, because you're going to want to have friends with males and females, with people with any kind of sexual orientation. It won't matter. And so I always say, if you could study astrology, or like you said, this information is accessible on the internet, if you could do that, it's a way to know yourself. And when you know yourself, you make much better choices in life. I just had a client yesterday who said to me, and I get this all the time, and you probably get it as well, you're better than a therapist, and I think we are, because why is that? Because we have a bigger picture of what's going on in their life. We understand the cycles. We can give them, real solid information as to what's going on and when it might end or what they need to do. And I'm nothing against therapists. I have a lot of friends who are therapists, but often they have to go through extensive testing of the client. They have to go through a lot of hoops that we kind of shortcut, because we can look at an astrology chart and see the personality, right? Personality is character, and character is destiny.
Love that quote. Love it.
There it is. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I want to ask you again, Sandra, for people that are listening, if they can, obviously they can get their chart online, and they can learn which symbols mean what. So, which is the symbol for Sagittarius? That's all available, all information they can find, and then they could identify through the NASA website or another source when there was a solar eclipse prior to their birth. So can you help tell us, for example, some examples of the prenatal eclipse, what it means when it's under different elements, for example, so earth, fire, air, water as a starting point?
Well, if it's under the fire element, so first of all, the prenatal solar eclipse is about what you come in this world to teach or to share with others. We want to make that clear, because the prenatal lunar eclipse, which by the way I have not studied in depth, but the lunar eclipse is said to be what you came here to learn. And remember that the prenatal eclipses, the solar eclipse is usually close to one of the nodes. It might be in the same sign as one of the nodes, so it would be somewhat similar. But when it's in a fire sign, it has to do with expressing, with motivating other people, with acting. You're not going to sit back and not do anything if it's in a fire sign. It's about spirit, and it's about talking about spirit, or at least practicing some kind of spirituality in your lifetime. That's what we usually see if it falls in a fire sign. And it's also about you being able to be, again, motivated and enthusiastic about something, or motivating other people, because that's what fire signs are about. If it's in an earth sign, it has a lot to do with the body, believe it or not. It has a lot to do with people watching the type of food they eat, the amount of food they eat, about keeping the body purified and clean, believe it or not, or setting that example for other people. You could also say that in earth signs, because it's the practical sign, it might have something to do with money, right? With finances, money, with, like, when people don't realize, but when you charge something to a credit card, you're making a promise to the credit card company that you're going to pay your debt. And people say, well, that's a big company, and, I'm late on my payments, but you're breaking promises then. That's not the best karma to be creating. So if you have your prenatal solar eclipse in an earth sign, you want to be careful that you pay your debts, right? And that you're upfront about those kind of things, among other things. And then if it's in an air sign, it's a lot about how you socialize and interact with people. It's a lot about how you communicate with people, what you say to people. And it's also about, we could say it's intelligence, but it's also about using your mind or using your intelligence in a positive way that might benefit people. So that could be people who like you do, even though yours is in the fire sign, but people who might have radio shows or television shows because they're communicating, or they're writers, but not necessarily. It could just be how you communicate with your family. And if it's in water signs, you really have to learn to develop compassion, and you have to be able to express your emotions with, as the therapist would say, and of course I have a degree in therapy myself, using I statements, right? This is how I feel, not like you did this to me, but I felt like this when, you said that. It's using these I statements. So the water signs you can find with people who are healers and physicians and nurses, or any kind of alternative medicine people. Sometimes it's expressed that way if the prenatal eclipse is in a water sign, because again, you're feeling the compassion for other people, and that's it. It's kind of, you have to line it up with the other planets. But here's something to think about. Let's say that you have a lot of earth and water signs in your chart. So that's like when you think of earth and water, right? Earth, think of a container that's like a mud container, and you think the water, it holds the water in, right? So it's very safe, it's very confined, and yet your prenatal eclipse is in a fire sign, your prenatal solar eclipse. So you have to learn to sort of take a risk once in a while if it's in a fire sign. You have to learn to step out of that safe container. And that might be hard for you because you don't have many fire signs in your chart. So that would be the challenge that it brings to you.
Fascinating. Now, I know in your article, Sandra, you wrote about the key planet. So actually looking at the prenatal eclipse and then working through the chart counterclockwise, as you said, and identifying the key planet. Can you tell us more about that key planet and how we can interpret different key planets?
Yeah, you're going to look at that key planet, whatever it is. Like in your chart, you said it was Mars. You look at the aspects it makes to the other planets. Are there trines? Are there squares? Are there oppositions? If there's a lot of trines to your particular Mars or your key planet, if there's trines, then your last life maybe wasn't that difficult, because the trines say maybe you learned a lot. You brought forth a lot of wisdom in this lifetime when you were born. But if it makes a lot of squares, then it might have been a difficult past life, and one that had too many issues. There was too much, traumatic experiences. So it tells us, that's why it's the key. It's the key to the last life. And it can tell us a lot about what the experience was, or if there's oppositions. I always say the thing about oppositions, squares are your own issues. You can't go blaming another person if you have, say, the moon square Mars. You could be angry a lot because you can't express your emotions clearly, but you can't blame it on your spouse or your parents. It's your issue. But if you have oppositions, somebody else brings the challenge to you, brings kind of mirrors your personality, and you want to blame them. But again, the oppositions are good because the other person makes you aware of what you need to work on in your personality. Another thing I want to add here is when we were talking about kind of past lives and mission, you can take the moon in your chart and you can look at the last planet the moon passed over. And I don't know if you understand that. And then you look at the next planet, the moon, and this is in the natural zodiacal order, which again is that counterclockwise order. And you look at the next planet the moon is about to come to, and that tells you what you're doing in this lifetime, what you need to develop, what's important for you to work on. The planet the moon last passed over shows a lot about your past lifetime as well. As an example, Steve, let's use your chart. Where is your moon?
My moon is part of a triple conjunction in Aquarius in the 5th house.
So what is the next planet the moon comes to in natural zodiacal order?
Counterclockwise.
Counterclockwise in Aquarius, so later degrees of Aquarius.
Actually, right? My moon's 9 degrees Aquarius in the 5th, and it's exactly conjunct Venus and Mercury. But the next planet counterclockwise is Jupiter in Pisces in the 6th house.
Well, no, it would be your Venus and Mercury if they're ahead of the moon. Are they? Is your Venus 9 degrees and a few minutes later than the moon?
No, it's 6 seconds earlier than the moon.
What about
Venus
Mercury?
Is 6 seconds earlier than the moon.
Mercury's earlier than the moon. So the next one is Pisces then.
Yeah, and I have Jupiter in Pisces.
Well, there it is. So in this lifetime, you're supposed to be Jupiter. You're supposed to be the teacher. You're supposed to be the publisher. I mean, you're doing all of that. You're supposed to be the person who makes people feel good, Jupiter. The benefactor in a sense. Or, the wise sage would be Jupiter. So the last planet your Mercury passed over was Mercury, right? Because it's that close, or was it Venus?
It passed over. Moon passed over Mercury and then Venus.
Mercury. So in the other lifetime, one of the things you did was, again, Mercury, almost like your South Node in Gemini. We have a very similar theme here for you. So it was like you gathered the information. You might have developed skills, but they weren't used maybe on a mass level. They were used more locally or more personally. See what I'm saying? Not that there's anything wrong with that. But that it's giving you, that's interesting because it gives you the very same theme in your chart as that South Node in Gemini. How about that? Oh, and then the moon comes to Jupiter, which is the Sagittarius planet. So my goodness, this is a very important life for you. Yeah, you're getting that theme a couple of different times. That is really fascinating to me.
Yeah, my Jupiter's my weakest planet, actually. It is harmonious, but it's my weakest planet, so it shows that I really do need to work on that. I need to be a good
Jupiter,
boy, right?
But Jupiter in Pisces, if you take the ancient rulerships, it's actually ruled by Pisces. Jupiter rules Sagittarius, but it also rules Pisces as well. So that's not, I wouldn't consider it that weak myself, because it's dignified in the sign of Pisces. It's not unhappy there. It just gives you a broader perspective of seeking understanding in the world, which is what you do, right? That's what you do very well.
Well, thank you, Sandra. Sandra, I want to ask you about other eclipses. So we know that eclipses come in series, sometimes very long series. Is there is there any benefit in looking at other eclipses to prior to one's birth?
Well, not really. I mean, you're talking about series. There's the Serio cycle, which is just where the eclipse starts at either the North or South Pole, and how it has a cycle, that it produces each Serio series can produce a solar eclipse every 18 years, 9 to 11 days. But what's important in the prenatal solar eclipse, and I'm so glad you brought this up, is that those eclipses will repeat every 19 years or a little less.
Yes.
So they can repeat 18 and a half years to 19 years. They don't always repeat as a solar eclipse. They can repeat as a new moon. But so you take your age, and you know that somewhere between the age of 18 and a half and 19, you can look in the ephemeris to see, was it a solar eclipse that repeated the prenatal solar, or was it a lunar eclipse, or was it, a new moon? And it will be within 1 or 2 degrees of the original prenatal eclipse. And why is this important? Because if it's a new moon, that year could be significant, but if it's a solar eclipse, oh my goodness, that year is ultimately significant to your life. And an example I gave to that was Angelina Jolie, and we had her prenatal solar eclipse that I think was in 8 degrees of Taurus, and don't you think, it was in Taurus, 19 degrees Taurus, and don't you think that last year in May, her prenatal solar eclipse now, repeated itself at 19 degrees of Taurus, and what happened to her last year? What does Taurus represent? Beauty, right? Among other things. And that was the year that she came out publicly, I think a month or 2 before that eclipse, and said she had a double mastectomy because she had that gene that was most likely to produce breast cancer. So here we have this goddess icon that's world famous, and she had her breast removed. I mean, that was very big. And I felt with her that there was a lot of karma in a positive, good way that she did for the women of the world, to just say, look, beauty is more than skin deep, because I can remove my breasts, and I can replace them, and they can look sort of natural and all that. But what is she saying? When you think about her wonderful message to people. Now, if that was just a new moon, that probably wouldn't have happened. But it was a repeat of her prenatal solar eclipse. And again, it happens approximately at age 19, at age 38, at age 57, which you could say, well, that's the second Saturn return, which is true. And then it repeats again at age 76, and then it repeats again at 95. So those are years that you should all look at in your life, and if one of those years is especially significant, go back and check to see, was that a repeat of the prenatal solar eclipse, or was it just a new moon? And most likely you're going to find that it's a prenatal solar eclipse, and also that's repeating. And it's even more significant in a person's life if the one that repeats is a total solar eclipse. So coming up this year of 2014, on October 8th, we have a total lunar eclipse at 15 degrees of Aries, 5 minutes. So just for the listeners out there, if your birthday is around that date, like if your birthday is around October 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, or 10th, that eclipse is really on your birthday. And often you will see some change in your lifestyle. And you'll see it either 4 months before or sometimes up to 6 months afterward. And because it is an eclipse in Aries, if your birthday is around the 3rd of April, the 4th, the 5th, 6th, or 7th of April, that eclipse is right on your sun sign. So that's also significant. And then we have another eclipse October 23rd this year, and it's a solar eclipse at 0 degrees of Scorpio. So people born on the cusp of Libra Scorpio, right when it's changing, they're going to have a lunar eclipse, a solar eclipse, which says there's some new direction unfolding in their life. How do we know where? You have to know what house it's in. The house will tell you where it's unfolding. The sign tells you the energy. So Scorpio is very deep, intense energy that could bring lessons to people about
it's so
sometimes
interesting,
it's
Sandra.
ego. Yeah. Yes.
Sandra, it's been wonderful to have you on the show. You've got so much knowledge, and everybody has access to your website through our website as well. I know that we'll be looking up to learn more about your work and watching out for articles from you. And I want to thank you. It's been just wonderful to have you with us, Sandra.
Thank you.
Extremely informative. Thank you so much.
And good luck with your show.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Res Miranda. If you're having relationship, career, or life issues, I'm inviting you to experience what it's like to have access to professional, highly accurate psychics and spiritual advisors you can trust to care and help you. Register now to get your free 6-minute reading by telephone or chat. Get answers, get access, psychic access, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. PsychicAccess.com.
Sandra's a full-time professional astrologer with a master's degree in psychology, and for 26 years she wrote a weekly astrology column for the Sun newspapers in northeastern Ohio, and she has over 25 years of experience. She's worked with thousands of clients from all over the US. She teaches, lectures, and makes media appearances. She's also certified by ISAR and the American Federation of Astrologers, and she serves as president of the Rocky Mountain Astrologers Organization as well. So, Sandra, it's wonderful to have you with us. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you with us, Sandra. We're very interested in your expertise and your research work. I originally read your article in the Mountain Astrologer about the prenatal eclipse. So I want to ask you, first of all, Sandra, if you could explain to us and our listeners exactly what an eclipse actually is.
Well, eclipses are actually, in the simplistic way that I could describe them, they are conjunctions and oppositions of a new or full moon. The difference is we have the Earth and the Moon and the Sun lined up together. But when we have a lunar eclipse, the Earth is in the middle with the moon on one side and the sun on the other side. So there's this pull of gravity having to do with the moon, and then we have the solar influence on the other side. And that's why during a regular full moon, people get a little crazy because it supposedly affects the water level, the fluid level in your brain, and a lot of things happen. There's often domestic violence. There's often more difficulty if you're having surgery, which we try to avoid clients if it's not an emergency. Don't do surgery 5 days before or 5 days after the full moon because there's too much of a chance of something going wrong. And so to get back to your question, there's a couple different types of eclipses. The most powerful ones are total eclipses. And there's also partial, so it means that the disk of the moon isn't totally occluded, by the sun. Observed that there was some kind of big change that happened to anything, different things would happen. And that's because it would affect individual charts. It would also affect the charts of certain countries and the world. So I think they didn't consider every single eclipse ominous, but only certain ones, like the total ones that darken the sky. And even today, we can look at eclipses and see where the shadow falls across the earth. And that's where we're most likely to see some political or geographical activity, like, earthquakes and things like that. I mean, not every single time. It depends on the eclipse.
It's fascinating, Sandra, that given the amount of research, the amount of validation we have about astrology, about the fact that eclipses do herald events that will occur in our world, isn't it fascinating that generally people still don't acknowledge how...
I mean, it's complicated, and then there's the annular eclipses, and you just see the ring instead, and there's the prenumbral, which is just the shadow. So again, there are different types of eclipses, of course, but the total are the most powerful because they have to line up with the node of the moon, and a lunar eclipse has to be within 3 degrees and 45 minutes of the node. The moon has to be that close, or you're not going to have an eclipse. With the solar eclipse, it's within 9 degrees, 55 minutes of one of the nodes. So you see the difference, why total lunar eclipses are so very powerful. And by the way, in a year, if I look at my calendar, you can get maybe 2 in a year, sometimes only 1 in a year. So they're not that common.
And can you explain to us why the ancients considered eclipses to be so ominous in terms of world events?
Well, it scared them when the sky darkened, right? If it was daylight and there was an eclipse, they got a little frightened, and then they always that we get a new and a full moon every month when the sun and the moon line up. The difference with an eclipse has to do with something called declination, the nodes of the moon. It's very technical stuff, but it has to line up not only in longitude from the ecliptic, but also from the celestial equator, north or south. And that only occurs 4 to 6 times a year. Sometimes it's 4 to 8 times a year. And that describes what an eclipse is.
Well, that's interesting for us to know. I also wanted to ask you if you could explain the different types of eclipses. So we all know that there are lunar eclipses and solar eclipses, but how do they differ? And what do they mean?
They differ. First of all, you have to understand, if you think of the solar system, so we have the Earth, and then we have the Sun, and of course there's planets in between the Earth and the Sun, but the Moon orbits around the Earth orbits around the Sun. So when there's a solar eclipse, what happens is